Um, Ian wants to start with a story.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I guess it's easy to start. So you said a lot can change over 20 years. I think about in 2009, I worked at a bookstore out in the suburbs, and you were coming through with Bernadine Dorn to talk about your book, Race Course: History of White Supremacy, and I was very excited. I was going to get my book signed, and somebody bricked the window of the bookstore, and they canceled the reading, and I
Was
never
this
got to.
was this in Naperville?
It was in Naperville, Anderson's bookshop.
I remember it
And
because, during that period, I got canceled a lot, and I was always disappointed, of course, but understood the feelings. I mean, the Andersons people wrote me and said, we don't want our employees are being threatened and so on. And I get that. But on the other hand, I always felt like enormous, I don't know, admiration for libraries and bookstores that went through with it, even when they were getting threats. The most
Mhm.
memorable actually was I was scheduled to speak at the University of Wyoming. Um, and then I got caught up in the frenzy of the Obama campaign, and they canceled me because they'd gotten a ton of threats. And I got a phone call from a young woman, and she said, "I'm a student at the University of Wyoming. I'm a veteran of the Iraq War, and I am suing the university because I want to hear you speak. I'm not interested in your free speech. I'm interested in my free speech." And I thought
mhm.
that was such a good stance. And I said, "Fine." And she said, "Would you be willing to participate?" I said, "Tell me how." And so she brought the lawsuit into federal court, and I went out to testify. And I flew into Denver, and my son Chesa was a law student at Yale at the time. He met me at the Denver airport. He was my bodyguard. He was my heat. And we drove up to the university, and I met with this woman who was fantastic, feisty, kind of militant person. And she was very clear that she felt that free speech included the right to learn and the right to think. It wasn't just about your right to say whatever the hell you want, it was her right. And so we went into court, and the president of the university testified. And he said, "Look, I have to worry about the safety of my university." And the federal judge, he looked down from the bench. He was a Reagan appointee. And he said, "Look, you have a responsibility to protect your university. Yes, that has nothing to do with the issue of free speech. If that were the case, if every time you got a threat, you couldn't speak, there would be no civil rights movement, there would be no, labor movement, there'd be no progress. So no, he has a right to speak, and you better protect your university." So what was great about the end of that is that then a couple months later, I did go out to give this speech, and it was a named lecture, and they were going to pay me some small amount of money in transportation, and there probably would have been 25 people there or 50 people at most.
Right.
But because of this, they had to move it to an auditorium, and there were 2,000 people. And when I came out on the stage, I could feel the disappointment, because here was this old professor shuffling across the stage. Where's the scary person? Where's the terrorist? And I didn't fit the stereotype at all. But I gave the talk, and then a month later, I get a call from this young woman again. And it turns out that Ann Coulter has decided to go and speak to the conservative club to kind of rid the university of whatever radical toxins I'd left on campus.
Of course.
And this woman, this young woman, with her creative juices fully flowing, decided, instead of picketing her, or instead of having a protest of some kind, they would have a contest, and you could pledge money every minute that Ann Coulter spoke, that you would pledge money to the fund that was set up in honor of the young gay man who was killed
Mhm.
outside the university.
Yeah.
And they had this giant sign outside the auditorium that said, "Keep talking, Ann." And they, at some point, she referenced it. She said, "I'm going to stop talking because they're raising money for this cause, which I don't believe in." Anyway, good, good, good on the person who thinks of those creative tactics.
Yeah, absolutely.
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 Absolutely. I think that probably would have been Matthew Shepard, right?
It was the Matthew Shepard Fund, and it
Yeah.
left my mind. But Matthew Shepard is a icon in that area.
Hmm.
His parents set up a foundation after he was beaten to death for the
Yeah.
crime of being gay. And Ann Coulter at one point referenced it. She said, "I'm going to stop talking. I don't want to raise too much money for Matthew Shepard." So,
Well, I mean that I think is part of why we wanted to start there is just that these you've been a part of these types of conversations for so long, and you know, this new book is a different way, I guess, of approaching some of those
New book.
questions.
Boom.
Yeah,
There you
boom.
go.
And I think the first thing me and Jim were interested in is just the word abolition in the title. Obviously, I know you've talked about before that brings up the image of the abolition of slavery. I know that we use that word a lot more in political discourse now regarding prisons and the abolition or the abolition of the military industrial complex, etc. But I just was interested in what you think of when you think of abolition in that modern context.
there are two words in the title. When freedom is the question, abolition is the answer. I'll say a word about abolition and then maybe a word about freedom.
Sure.
Because for me, abolition, you're absolutely right to reference Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and the abolitionist movement of the 1830s, 40s, 50s. Actually, the abolitionist movement started when the first, ship of slaves landed in North America. So there's always been an abolitionist movement, but it gained traction and force. And certainly everyone should, if you want to understand the canon of abolition, Frederick Douglass is a good place to start, but he's not the beginning. He is one of the most eloquent and brilliant and I think important spokespeople for abolition, not just the abolition of slavery, but abolition as a philosophy, as a concept. Because think of it, Frederick Douglass was born into slavery. He escaped his own imprisonment. He went on to become an unbelievably eloquent and brilliant speaker about slavery and about the sin of slavery. He lived to see Reconstruction, and he lived to see the crushing of Reconstruction. So here was this long life, and I reference him often in regard to what do we do now? Well, what did Frederick Douglass do when Reconstruction was defeated? Did he sit down and go home? No, he got up and continued to another day in the struggle, and that's kind of how I think about this moment. It's another morning, another fresh morning in the broken world. Let's get busy. Let's go to work. But yes, Douglass is a good beginning. Interestingly, Karl Marx, who in the Communist Manifesto, I think he mentions communism a half a dozen times. He mentions abolition 20 times.
Hmm.
And so abolition is a concept that's bigger than any epic or any person. But if you follow the canon about abolition and you get up more to the modern age, then you are looking at Angela Davis and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and
Mhm.
Ruth Gilmore and Erica Miners, a Chicagoan, Alice Kim. There's a whole canon about abolition. And I wanted to make a small utterance in that conversation. And for me, abolition is way, way more. The more you dig into it, it's way more than unlocking a gate or undoing some shackles. It really is about imagining a world that could be, but is not yet, a world where slavery is unthinkable, or a world where prisons are unnecessary. What would that world look like? And it seems like it's not only demonized, but it seems like pie in the sky to sit here in 2025 in the immediate aftermath of the election of Donald Trump and to say, well, we want to abolish prisons. But think about it. If you and I were sitting here in 1845 and we were abolitionists and we were having a meeting, and some of us were going to knock on doors and make leaflets, some of us were going to write op-eds, some of us were going to back political candidates, some of us were going to build an underground. All these things were happening, but it's 1845. And because we're abolitionists, our meeting is small. We're against the Constitution, the founders, the president, the law, our preacher, the Bible, our parents, our neighbors. But what the hell? We're abolitionists. But who could have imagined that 20 years later, the institution would be crushed. Wow, what an amazing thing. And so that gives me a lot of hope to try to keep an historical perspective and to recognize that I told you guys that I'm 80 years old. And I often think that's a really long time in the life of a human being. But it's really the blink of an eye in the life of a struggle. It's nothing. I mean, and I've lived all 80 years pretty full throttle. I'm planning to keep going, but the struggle will keep going for sure. And I want to think about abolition as world building, not as erasure, but as construction. So let's construct a world where prisons are unthinkable, just as slavery became unthinkable. Let's imagine a world where policing isn't what we assume it to be today, but actually, what would policing look like in a genuine democracy? How would it how would it feel different? And what's the difference between an occupying force and a safety force? I mean, you can play with these ideas. So I know I'm a bit of a utopian, but that's where I begin my thinking about abolition. And so I'll just say one more thing about the word, and that is that if you think of anything that is oppressive or cruel or unfair or exploitative or dangerous, then what you want to think of in terms of a solution is abolition. You don't want to think of, oh, I've got this cruel, dangerous, predatory situation. I think I'll tweak it. No, you want to get, and that's why abolition to me is a useful politics to organize all your thinking around.
And I
Absolutely. And I
mean,
think
go for it.
looking at this historically, zooming out, also brings to mind that this isn't America's first brush with fascism, right? The indigenous people experience fascism, we all continue to experience it, but it is a brand of fascism that I think a lot of people are able to say, oh, this is like what happened in Europe during World War II. Um, that it is not an extension of the American program, right? It is just, I think a lot of white liberals feel like it might be affecting them now.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's worth noting. I mean, the way you put it in my mind is perfect because, when we think of things like the Great Depression, there was a song, and I believe it was Leadbelly who wrote a blues tune and it said, people talking about hard times. I've never known anything but hard times. So the Great Depression of the 1930s was the entire society, including the privileged and the white, experiencing what was the experience of Black folks in the South always. So the idea
Mhm.
that somehow, ooh, it's remarkably new. No, it's old. And another way of saying the same thing is that I mentioned that the other word in the title is freedom, but it's worth noting that the fundamental American contradiction is that freedom for the conqueror is always misery, murder, and mayhem for the conquered. And that's our story. Our story
Mhm.
fought for freedom, and it included the freedom to own other human beings. It included the freedom to continue the North Atlantic free slave trade. It included the freedom to conquer west of the Appalachian Mountains. In other words, it was framed as freedom, but what does freedom mean? And it's important to keep in mind that freedom, well, two aspects. One is what I said, freedom for the conqueror is always murder for the conquered. But it's also true that social freedom is quite different than individual freedom. Individual freedom to drill wherever I want to build a golf course in a national forest or a police training grounds, and to rip up a beautiful forest in Atlanta, Georgia, to build a
Mhm.
police training ground. That's freedom for some, but it's not freedom for all. And that's why social freedom is so important. That we think about when you think of the word freedom, every American is for it. I mean, there's the Freedom Caucus in the Congress, the Right Wing Freedom Caucus. There's the insufferable Ron DeSantis's book, The Courage to Be Free, and then there's my favorite is the Visa card from Chase Bank called Freedom Unlimited. Oh, yeah, that's freedom, kind of. There's also the Black Freedom Movement. There's also the Queer Liberation Movement. There's also the Women's Freedom Movement. I mean, these are all movements. These are all using the word freedom as well. So the subtitle of my book is Reflections on Collective Liberation, because that's what I'm interested in. Collective liberation includes personal freedom, the right to drink at a drinking fountain or ride on a bus, but it also identifies a public that's being put down or kept down because of some quality, their race, their color, their class, their gender, their sexual preference. And as a public, as that public comes into view, it fights for liberation, which includes personal freedom, but it goes much deeper than that because it includes structural shifts. And that's what I think we should all be working toward.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that that is, I know that in the book you talk a lot about contradictions and, the nature of humanity is dealing with contradictions, but also, obviously politically, it would seem that both sides, at least rhetorically, would agree that freedom is a good thing. They like to use it, they like to use the word. But yeah, there seems to be a pretty large contradiction in what those people believe freedom to actually represent. And yeah.
I think they're pretty clear, and I think the clearest example that I think we should all be paying attention to, way beyond worrying about Elon Musk's Nazi salute, which is terrible, of course. But there's something much deeper going on, which is there are a group of hyper wealthy ruling class people today who believe that, and this is also not new, Jim, as you said, this is nothing new, but who believe that we would be best served if we got rid of democracy. And you and I know, I think your listeners know, that our democracy has always been flawed and partial and aspirational, um, even sometimes not aspirational, but it's always been imperfect and partial. So some of us, I was a member of Students for a Democratic Society. My father, my CEO father, said to me dismissively, freedom, Students for a Democratic Society. We are a democratic society. And we all laughed out loud because we didn't think so, because we thought participatory democracy includes everyone. And the goal is to include more and more and more voices, not less. But there is a group, Elon Musk being one example of it, but there are many, many others who believe in a kind of right-wing libertarianism, which believes that we ought to have a CEO dictator ruler who's benign and beneficent, but who rules in our favor, rather than allow the messy, imperfect, crazy uh, swirl of democracy. And I am still a member of Students for Democratic Society, and I'm still a student and I'm still for it. So I never got rid of my membership card. And on the membership card, it says, we are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, looking uneasily at the world we inherit. That's my stance still. I've always believed that, and I still believe I'm of this generation. I don't buy the whole 60s thing. Yeah, I don't know if, but sometimes I get identified as a person of the 60s. And I try to remind people that nobody looked at their watch on December 31st, 1969 and said, oh shit, it's almost over. Let's get high. I mean, we did high, but it had nothing to do. And it's worth, again, in where we started with the view of history, it's worth remembering that whatever we accomplished, and it was very minimal, but whatever we accomplished in terms of moving the notion of freedom forward in the 1960s and 1968 was built on the 1950s and 40s and 30s, all the way back to the Civil War and Black Reconstruction. And whatever we're living through now, whatever happened in 68 was prelude to what we have to do now, the challenges as well as the hopes and dreams. So I don't believe in decades. I believe we're people of this generation, if we're living and looking forward, which we should be. Nothing more depressing than 80-year-old who's looking nostalgically at a ship that already left the shore. And I'm not that.
Mhm.
I want to look forward, and I want to link arms with all the people of this generation and keep moving.
I think that makes me think a lot about who's Fred Hampton that said uh theory without uh theory without action isn't shit, right? And I think this is, why a lot of people still look at you as an enduring movement figure. Um, is that we've had your ass on the line for quite some time, Bill. Uh, and the last Trump administration, it was a lot of, hey, well, read this book, or a lot of book recommendations. Um, and I am someone who fucking has the books, right? All for reading theory. I do think it's an important part of it, but theory without action, it's just something kind of like a self-aggrandizing, uh, just to know you're right without acting on it. So I guess if I'm going to taking this to a question, and it's not, people are looking for easy answers, I know, and saying, go read a book, that's a real easy answer. Um, so when was the moment where you had the shift? I know it was very young for you. This shift that here's what I know, here's the values that I have, that I'm going to work to bring these forward in a real collective way.
Well, let me go back to your point. You're quoting Hampton. Fred Hampton, for those who don't know, was a young, charismatic, brilliant leader of the Chicago Black Panther Party who was killed by the Chicago police and the FBI in a pre-planned conspiracy to murder him. Um, so he said, so you quote him saying, a theory without action is nonsense or
Mhm.
not good. Or the best theory is good practice. And I would go the other way as well and say action without thinking is also problematic. So let's keep the dialectic, let's keep the contradiction.
Mhm.
We need to think and act and act and think. But theory that simply sits on a couch and makes predictions or makes statements about the society can't ever learn, because the best theory comes right out of the street. It comes right out of the factory or out of the workplace. So you have to develop your theory by engaging the world. And so I want to keep both the heart,
Mhm.
head, the mind, the body all in play. But I think you have to kind of, the reason that we act is partly to change reality, but it's also partly to know reality. You can't know it by reading Marx. I mean, I'm all for reading Marx, but let me also put in a word for study. I think in this period, we need to be more serious about study. And that means reading and thinking and talking together. And I think this period demands of us in a way that has been unfamiliar in some ways. It demands of us that we gather in small groups, that we think and read and talk and study together, as well as act together. So I do think I want to hold up study as a um,
Mhm.
worthwhile enterprise. But for me, I was 18 years old when I went to the University of Michigan out of a very privileged prep school north of Chicago. I went to Lake Forest Academy. 39 of us graduated, 39 boys graduated in 1963 from Lake Forest Academy. And of the 39, six of us became members of Students for a Democratic Society over the next 4 years. So they were doing something right. Um, but I went to Michigan. I was pretty alienated from classes and from a lot of things. And I dropped out of the University of Michigan, went south to try to find the civil rights movement. It was the winter of 1964, and things were pretty, on the decline. So I went to Baton Rouge and I joined the Merchant Marines. And I I was a merchant sailor. And when I came back to the United States and went back to Michigan, I fell in with a group of folks who were, I'd known them before, but they were protesting this, around civil rights and around, for example, a pizza place in Ann Arbor that wouldn't serve Black students and things like that. And I got kind of involved in that. And then the Vietnam War blew up. And we had it at Michigan, we we tried to get the professors to do a general strike in opposition to the war, and they pretty much argued back to us that professors don't strike, which isn't exactly true, but that's how they felt. And they said, but we're willing to have a day where we study Vietnam and talk about Vietnam in our classes. So the faculty senate passed such a resolution, and we decided to have a teach-in, the first teach-in, where the whole would kind of be dominated by talking about Vietnam and about Indochina. And we did some brilliant things, if you don't mind my saying so. We invited a State Department some junior State Department spokesman to come and debate an SDS person who wiped the floor with the guy. Guy had nothing to stand on. And so we started to realize our own agency, our own power, our own brilliance. And it's a good example, parenthetically, speaking about today. I think we spend too much time, progressive people in particular, looking at the sites of power we have no access to: the White House, the medieval auction block called the Congress, Wall Street, the Pentagon, and too little time looking at the sites of power we have absolute access to: the street, the neighborhood, the workplace, the classroom, the house of worship, all of that and more. We have power. And mobilizing that power is actually much more sensible in my mind. If you want to feel powerless, read the New York Times, watch MSNBC, and see what the Congress is doing. I mean, you'll feel like crap at the end of every. But if you want to feel powerful, do what we did then, which is debate the bastards and see that we actually aren't stupid. That we actually are okay. So the first teach-in, the president of Students for a Democratic Society came in from Chicago, a guy who later became a very good friend of mine named Paul Potter. And Paul gave a speech. And the line that I'll never forget from that speech was when he said to this group of maybe 100 students in a classroom, he said, "You have to try to live your life in a way that it doesn't make a mockery of your values." And that phrase just was like lightning for me. And I thought, wow, what does that even mean? And it wasn't giving us the 10 commandments or the rules of activism. He was saying, figure out your values, figure out what you stand for, and then stand for it. Do something. And that's echoed in my head for all these 65 years since, because I think it's great advice. Live your life in a way that is consistent with or doesn't make a mockery of your values. I've argued this to teachers forever. Live your teaching life in such a way that it doesn't make a mockery of your teaching values. And so that was the electric moment for me, Jim. That was the moment that hit me very hard and has stayed with me. I think we should say, read this book. I think we should also join this demonstration. I think we should also, um, build a union. I think we should also, there are many things we can do. And I think we're very lucky, the three of us, to live in Chicago, which has historically been a site of social progress and thinking and activism. And right now, if you look at groups like the Let Us Breathe Collective, or like Black Lives Matter Chicago, or like the Chicago Abortion Fund, or like Undocumented and Unafraid, you will feel the surge. You will feel the power, because it's there, and it's a movement, and it's a movement in motion.
I know that speaking for me and Jim, I know that being out during 2020 with those groups was incredibly inspiring for us, and especially at that time when it was so up in the air. And I guess that was one of the questions we wanted to talk about. And I think um, living your values is a good answer to it. Just that we've only been, I was in high school or just out of high school in 2009. And I think that it's easy for a lot of people, especially now talking about Trump, to despair over those movements, and I think that having that idea of being able to pursue your values and stand for your values is a good way to kind of confront those feelings that there's a backslide happening on a national level. And I think during COVID, during 2020, seeing the local churches get together to help everyone in our ward is an inspirational way to move forward. But I guess that was the question: is how do you keep, like Frederick Douglass watching the end of Reconstruction, like how do you keep moving forward when the forces of some reactionary forces come back and start to get their way on some things?
Well, in my view, a lot of it has to do with what I said a minute ago, which is gathering around with other people. You can't do it alone. You can't keep your hope alive, and you can't keep your head straight by sitting on your couch smoking a joint. I'm all for that, but it's not enough. You have to reach out and be with people. And there are a lot of, especially as the public space is disappearing, as the public is intentionally being destroyed, it's really more important than ever to seek out those sites where the public gathers. And that the attack on schools is very much one of the, I think, really dangerous attacks on one of the last remaining public spaces. To watch the universities uh, go into an anticipatory surrender is frightening to me. And so I think we have to kind of buck up and be public. I mean, the universities seems, I could go through a whole thing about the universities, but not only last spring were they unable in a full-throated way to defend academic freedom, by which I don't mean freedom of speech, I mean the right to teach, the right to learn, the right to think at all. And they couldn't do it. And that was mind-boggling in its own right. But then to go back to the campuses and crush this utopian, marvelous example of education for the people, which I visited 5 of those encampments, and they were stunning in their humanity, their overall humanity. To crush those, and then over the summer to change all the rules. And what the universities are doing now, the ones that I'm close to and that I know about, are having conversations where they basically say, if we just keep our heads down, maybe they won't see us. And that is the worst reaction to, this kind of thing. So I want to go back to 2020. That was the largest public demonstration against white supremacy and racism that I've ever seen or ever participated in. It was wonderful that we had to keep social distance because Bernadine and I were in our late 70s and we couldn't keep up with the march. So we were social distance by requirement, by necessity. But I think that the fact that people poured out should give us all tremendous strength. Yes, it's been reversed in many ways. It's been co-opted in some ways. It's been reduced to DEI in some places. Now DEI is under attack. What's amazing is, you look at the reactionaries over the last 40 years, they attacked the 60s, then they said, well, let's attack the 30s. Then they went back to the 1890s, and now they're attacking the 14th Amendment. It's staggering. When parenthetically, one of the things I'm disappointed about when people talk about birthright citizenship is they don't go back to the history of it and why it matters and why it mattered then, because it was an attempt to solidify the fact that formerly enslaved workers were now citizens, that they now had a right to everything else that everybody else had. And I want to go back to this question of despair, because it sometimes feels like the very darkest of times, and it's important, as you said earlier, Jim, that things aren't new always, that there are precedents, and we can see how other people did. We can look around the world and see how other people have dealt with living under fascism or under authoritarianism. It's everywhere. So it's not like we're the first people to ever experience this. And there are great models and examples of people fighting back and organizing and acting up. But I think that it's important to say that while unhappiness grief, fear, dread, all of those things are understandable, but despair is never justifiable. And the reason is because as long as we're alive and as long as history is moving, it's not only unrealistic, but it's cynical to be in despair because things are moving, everything is in motion. And the idea that my experience of this moment is somehow the whole of it is false on every dimension. So I think it's really important to say we want to resist despair. We can understand sadness, we can embrace grief, but despair is one step beyond. I also feel this way about, I'm often accused of being an optimist, which I'm not. I'll stipulate right from the start. My mother was an optimist. I used to kid my mother that she and Karl Marx had a lot in common because they knew how things were going to turn out. But I had no fucking idea how they were going to turn out. So I'm not an optimist. I choose, on the other hand, every day to be hopeful. And the reason I choose that is because it gives me energy to go forward. I kiddingly told my kids for years that I wake up every morning thinking maybe today will overthrow capitalism. And then I go to bed disappointed, but not despairing. I'm disappointed. And maybe tomorrow. But the reason I feel that way is because pessimists know what's going to happen and they can sit on their couch and look at the rest of us like a bunch of sheep and fools. Optimists also know what's going to happen. It's all going to turn out fine. That was my mother. And I don't have any idea how it's going to turn out. And therefore, I think I should get up in the morning, put my shoulder to the wheel, work as hard as I can, and then keep going with others, arm in arm. Because I think, if you think about it, the day before Rosa Parks sat in on the bus, the modern civil rights movement was impossible, according to all the commentators. The day after, it was inevitable. And that's true of every revolution in history. The wise guys know beforehand that it's not going to happen, and afterwards that it had to happen. But none of that is true. It depends on what we do or don't do. It depends on huge historical forces as well, but we can play a part in that. We can be involved in that. Interestingly, I had dinner, Bernardine had dinner with the great Latin American revolutionary, Eduardo Galeano, the Uruguayan revolutionary. I don't know if you know his work. Open Veins in Latin America is a must read. As long as, Jim, I'm giving books, read this book, Open Veins in Latin America. But we had dinner with Galeano and we were joking the fact that we're both accused of being optimists. And he said, people always say I'm utopian. And he said, one guy said to me, "What good is utopia?" And I said to him, yeah, you're right. If I walk 2 steps towards utopia, utopia walks 2 steps away. If I walk 10 steps towards utopia, utopia walks 10 steps away. So what good is utopia? And my response was, it's good for walking. And I think that's really a nice way to think about it. We have a North Star. It's not fixed. It's not dogma. It's not worked out. But we know that another world is possible. In fact, another world is coming. But could it be a world of more justice, more peace, more fairness, more equity, more sharing of the common good? If it could be that, let's work toward that. And that's, I think, what Galeano and us and others are trying to do.
Absolutely.
When talking about despair, it leads me to thinking about, our show Exhibit B, or, it's part reading series, part artist collective, largely because we knew, or regarding talking about living your values, we understood that us doing art individually is important on some levels. It's important for yourself. It's important to dream. It's important to imagine, right? But that art is something that communities can build around. And we're always at this, I don't know, we're kind of torn as to art's role in progressive social movements, right? On one level, it feels very insular, right? Um, and so I guess I know it's something you've written a lot about. Where do you think uh, art or where specifically writers, uh, where does that fit in this mix?
Well, what comes to my mind, Jim, immediately is that I think art and humor have the capacity to illuminate the present and to project a future like nothing else. And I often think that one of the problems that I have had and that the left has is we're way too earnest and way too linear. And art explodes that, and so does humor. So I remember once 30 years ago, I was a brand new professor and I was giving a talk in Minnesota about school reform. And I thought it was an okay talk. And the first question from the audience was, why do you think you're better than us? And it really hit me hard. And what one thing, but why are you lecturing to us? Why are you pointing your finger? And what's really good art does is it doesn't point its finger. It doesn't wag its finger at you. It doesn't, it invites you into something. But I think there is a difference. And I agree with the contradiction that I think you were pointing to, which is art is both an individual expression and a collective undertaking. It can have both aspects. Everything in our lives has a social as well as an individual aspect. And keeping that tension alive rather than collapsing into one or the other, I think is hugely important. But art has the capacity to see things as if they could be otherwise. And I can't, as a writer, as a person who scribbles, I write some, I find collective writing to be insufferable. I can't read it. The Central Committee wrote a statement, blech, you want to gag. But at the same time, I can't pretend that my writing comes out of the brilliance of my own brain. It doesn't. But at the same time, I don't have to stop and footnote my mother or footnote, some scholar to
Right.
say something. I can say I believe in freedom without footnoting everybody who said that. Um, so it's a tricky thing, Jim. It's a contradiction. I think art can build community, and I think community can build art. And I think that if you think of, I'm thinking now of social movements, I'm moving away from art. But one of the things that Ella Baker often said is it took a great movement to create a Martin Luther King. And I think that's really a good way to put it. King didn't create the movement created King. And the way we read and write history is so messed up on so many levels. But you know, that you'll sometimes read in a textbook, the 1954 Supreme Court decision on Brown versus Board of Education unleashed decades of struggle. A better way to say it was decades of struggle led to the Supreme Court decision, which led to decades of struggle. I mean, the
Mhm.
idea that somehow
Mhm.
things are all flattened out. And so I'm coming back to art. I think the same is true of art. I don't think of great art as being decorations in the sky. I don't think that that's great art, but I do think great art can come from brilliant people who are cast up um, by a society, by a social reality. And I think for those of us who believe in humanity and believe that humanity ought to have a future, I think the use of art as a expression, as a tool, as a relief, as an act of joy, all of those things are part of what art is. So but as I said earlier about humor, I think, and I said humor and art are better than didactics, because I think both of them are generous. I think art can be generous in a way that didactic finger wagging
Mhm.
can never be generous.
Mm.
And I know like my father, who was a huge businessman in Chicago, he lived with us the last several years of his life with Alzheimer's. And I found, and of course I loved him and we had a great few years together, even though he disagreed profoundly with everything I had done until he got dementia and then he thought I was pretty cool. But so it had its positive. But I remember with my dad, that um, sometimes humor would get him over a hump that other things wouldn't. I showed him, and he was homophobic, and I showed him a cartoon from the New Yorker of two dogs walking down Fifth Avenue, and one dog is saying to the other, just because he rubbed your belly and you liked it doesn't mean you're gay. I mean, and you can kind of get over a certain hump with that. And if you think of all the great social movements that we've witnessed in this country or elsewhere, they always have music, they always have art, they always generate their own newspapers, their own, popular expressions. And I think that's worthwhile also.
Awesome.
And I got you got a last question, Ian, as I know I want to
Go
be
for it if you got
respectful of your
another one.
time.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
I think the last question is I don't know, just kind of general about Chicago.
Mm.
Me and Ian, we both grew up, unfortunately, in Naperville. We've been in the
I grew up in Glen Ellen.
yeah, I went to my
Suburb
first
kids.
school was
Went
the
to
College of
I went to
DuPage
Glen
over there.
I went to Glenbard West
Oh, nice.
when it was just Glenbard. So I know Naperville. I played football against Naperville.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Jim was a Waubonsee kid and I was a Naperville
Oh,
North kid.
or
So there you go.
and we've been into the city. We've lived in the city proper for 10 to
20
15
years, yeah.
years now. Um, and I think, and you're also a Chicagoan. Uh, what is it about this place that keeps us here, in the depths of winter? And what is it about it that has created so many important figures in these progressive movements?
Let me ask you first, have you guys been friends since high school?
No, we met at grad school in the city. So,
What grad school?
School of the Art Institute of Chicago. We were both MFAs there. So yeah.
Did you know Therese Quinn as a professor?
I don't think so. No.
No.
Therese was my graduate assistant. She's now
Awesome.
the head of museum studies at University of Illinois, Chicago. Anyway, a brilliant,
Awesome.
brilliant artist. Um, and you think about some of the artists coming out of Chicago, Kerry James Marshall, and I mean, just amazing um, people in both film and literature and the fine arts. Amazing place, music. Okay, so what about Chicago? You know, I I am a Chicago file. I would never live anywhere else. I'm not going to Florida. I'm not going west. I'm here. And partly, I think of somebody like Nelson Algren, never a city so real. I mean, Chicago has it all, every messy, messed up contradiction, what Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about in terms of redlining, in terms of segregation. It has the amazing influx of energy and creativity and brilliance that was the Great Migration. And then it has the 1919 race riot, which wasn't a race riot. It's funny, if you ride along Lakeshore Drive on your bike, which I do all the time, there's a marker to where the young man was drowned that kicked off that riot in 19, and that was Red Summer. There were riots all over the country. But the marker that is there, the little rock marker and the phrase that's there, I don't think it's from Naperville, but it's from one of the suburban schools put this marker up. And it says, as Martin Luther King said, a riot is the voice of the oppressed speaking out, or something like that. This was not the voice of the oppressed. This was a riot against Black people. It was a murderous attempt to keep Black people down. And so, people get confused about that history. But okay, 1919 happened. The Great Migration happened after that. Um, Industry, a great industrial hub, this brilliant, history of not only DuSable. DuSable married a native woman and moved to Iowa when she was deported. He moved with her and their children. So, it's got so much richness in history. Every contradiction, race, class, everything is embodied in this city, but also Buddy Guy and the blues. Also food and, expressions of joy and Nikki Giovanni and Hakeem Adabudi. And, we could go on and on with the literary figures, George Saunders. I mean, it's an amazing place. So I often think, I'm struggling because I often think, as I write in this particular book, that if you ask me to sum up Chicago, I could go on for pages and days.
Mhm.
I still wouldn't get to it. And the reason that's true is because it's too complicated. And I often think of my daughter-in-law who lived in China for many years, one of my daughters-in-law, and she adheres to the idea that if you spend a week in China, you'll write a book. If you spend a year in China, you'll write an article. If you spend 5 years in China, you're voiceless. There's nothing to say. And I feel that way about Chicago. Too damn complicated to sum up in any simple way. When I want to also be mindful of, Adrian Rich, great poet, essayist, who said, there are three ways to live in a city like Chicago. One is kind of the narcissistic. I love Chicago. I love the opera. I love the music. I love the lakefront. And you kind of take a cab to your gym and to your dinner,
Mhm.
and that's the narcissist. And then there's the kind of paranoid. Oh, Chicago, I have to. People say, "Oh, Chicago, do you lock the doors?" Actually, I don't lock my door. I worry more when I go to Naperville. Um, that's where the band live, and Chicago carjacking. And so the paranoid way of living in Chicago is kind of to triple lock doors, carry your mace with you at all times, don't jog because you might get killed, and so on. But the one that she lands on that I try to live is she says the third way of living in the city is something I have a hard time naming, but I think I'll call it city as lover. And I don't mean a romantic or an idealized love. I mean the love you feel with somebody who was preyed upon and praying, somebody who's damaged and bleeding, and you
Mhm.
love them anyway, and you work toward reconciliation, towards revival, towards um, resurrection. So that's Chicago for me.
It's great.
Incredible note
Yeah.
to end on. Bill, thank you so much for making time, and what an incredible description of Chicago. It really is all that